The applause was still ringing when I felt my stomach drop, sharp and sudden, like I'd missed a step in the dark. Crystal lights shimmered above us, champagne glasses caught the glow, and I stood there smiling while my future was quietly rewritten in front of everyone I loved. My hands were folded, my back straight, but inside I was unraveling, realizing that what sounded like generosity to them felt like erasure to me. If you've ever sat in a room where everyone seemed to agree on something you never consented to, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not as alone as you think. The music softened. The air felt heavier, and I understood that politeness can wound just as deeply as cruelty. In that moment, surrounded by celebration and silk dresses, I sensed that something precious was being taken without permission. I had no idea then how far that decision would go, or what it would force me to confront about myself. That was the moment everything began to unravel. 10. I realized my life had been rearranged without my consent, while a room full of strangers applauded. I was standing in the middle of my son's wedding reception when I understood that what was being called generosity was actually my removal. In that moment, under soft chandeliers and polite smiles, I felt something inside me go very still. The ballroom in Charleston glowed the way magazines promise happiness looks. Crystal lights scattered across white linens. Music floated gently through the air. People leaned toward one another, laughing quietly. Dressed in confidence and ease, I stood there at 63 years old, hands folded in front of me, listening as my future was described as if it were already settled. Already agreed upon. The applause came quickly, warm and approving. Heads nodded, smiles widened. To everyone else, it sounded like kindness. To me, it felt like being erased while standing fully visible. I remember my posture stiffening, my breath growing shallow, my face holding a smile that no longer belonged to my body. I was Evelyn Brooks, the mother of the groom, and somehow I had become an afterthought in my own story. What unsettled me most was not the announcement itself, but the certainty in the room. No one questioned it. No one hesitated. They accepted a version of my future that I had never spoken aloud, never agreed to, never imagined for myself. As the clapping faded, I understood something quietly and completely. To them, this decision was already made. And to understand why it hurt the way it did, I need to tell you who I was before that night. Before that night, my life had been quiet in a way that only comes after years of noise. I had earned that quiet the hard way. I was widowed young, left to raise my son Daniel on my own, while grief and responsibility shared the same space in my chest. There was no dramatic turning point, no single moment where I became strong. Strength came in small. Repeated decisions made every morning when getting up felt heavier than staying still. I learned the rhythm of survival early. Wake before sunrise, work, then work some more. Stretch meals, stretch patience, stretch hope. Daniel grew up watching effort instead of comfort, and I tried to give him something steadier than fear. I carried both roles, mother and father, without ever naming it that way. I just did what needed doing. Years passed like that, measured in routines rather than milestones. The farmhouse outside Somerville came much later. It wasn't large or impressive, but it was mine in a way nothing else had ever been. A creaking porch, a view of open land, mornings where the air smelled clean and unclaimed. That house was proof that I had survived everything that tried to wear me down. It represented independence, not isolation, peace, not escape. By the time Daniel was grown and building his own life, I believed the hardest chapters were behind me. I felt tired, yes, but also steady, proud in a quiet way. When I prepared for his wedding, I wasn't carrying fear or expectation. I arrived hopeful, believing I was stepping into a moment of joy, unaware that unease was already waiting for me just beneath the surface. The wedding itself was beautiful in a way that felt carefully curated. Everything shimmered. Soft music floated through the room. Glasses caught the light, and people moved with the ease of those who knew they belonged there. I arrived quietly, smoothing my dress, taking in the space, reminding myself that this day was about Daniel and the life he was beginning. At first, the discomfort was so small I almost missed it. My seat was tucked far from the main table, placed among people who greeted me politely but without recognition. I told myself it was a simple oversight. Weddings are complicated. Seating charts get messy. Still, as I sat there, I noticed how far away I felt from the center of things, how conversations flowed around me instead of including me. I watched Daniel from across the room. He looked confident, surrounded by new faces, moving easily between groups. His wife seemed perfectly at home, her laughter fitting naturally into the space. I felt proud of him, but also strangely distant, like I was observing my own life from the outside. I kept reminding myself that this was normal. Children grow, families expand. Change is supposed to feel like this, but the feeling lingered. Servers passed with dishes I barely touched. People glanced at me, then looked away. As if unsure where I fit, I told myself not to be sensitive, not to read meaning into small things. Still, something unspoken hung in the air, a quiet tension I couldn't name. As the evening continued, I noticed the room slowly shifting. The music softened. People turned their attention toward the stage. Conversations faded. I straightened in my chair, unaware that the moment forming in front of me was about to turn that unease into something far heavier. The room grew quiet in a way that felt deliberate. The music softened. Conversations paused, and attention gathered toward the stage as if pulled by an invisible thread. I remember sitting a little straighter, sensing that something important was about to happen, though I had no idea it would be about me. Lauren Whitmore stood there, composed and glowing, her presence calm and assured. What followed was framed as kindness, as consideration, as something thoughtful meant to put everyone at ease. My name was included gently, almost affectionately, and my future was presented as though it had already been discussed, already decided. The room responded instantly. Applause filled the space, warm and approving, like a seal placed on a finished agreement. Inside me, everything dropped. My hands tightened in my lap, my breath shortened. I felt exposed in a way I had never known before, standing still while my life was rearranged out loud. The kindness they heard sounded nothing like what I felt. It sounded like erasure dressed in politeness. I searched Daniel's face without turning my head. I didn't need words to understand what his stillness meant. There was no confusion there, no hesitation, no interruption. His silence landed harder than anything spoken. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. As the applause faded, clarity settled in. This wasn't generosity. It was displacement, delivered publicly and carefully enough that questioning it would make me look ungrateful. I felt something shift deep in my chest, a quiet certainty replacing shock. Everything had changed, and not because of where I might live next, but because of what they had taken without asking. To understand why that moment broke something open in me, you need to know what that farmhouse truly represented, and what it had cost me to claim it as my own. After the applause faded, my thoughts didn't rush forward. They moved backward. Years peeled away until I was standing inside the life that built that house. Piece by piece, the farmhouse wasn't something I bought on a whim or inherited with ease. It was paid for in exhaustion, in mornings that started before daylight and nights that ended with aching hands. It came from saying no to comforts so Daniel could say yes to opportunities. From patching what I had instead of replacing it, from learning how to stretch not just money, but patience and belief in myself. I remember the first time I unlocked that door alone. The sound of it turning felt like a promise kept. The floors creaked, the paint needed work, and the roof leaked in one corner. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet, the sense that I finally stood somewhere that didn't ask more of me than I could give. That house didn't just shelter me, it held every version of who I had been to survive. Others saw land, space, potential. To them, It was an asset that could be reassigned, rearranged, offered up as a solution. To me, it was proof that I had endured, that I had carried loss, responsibility, and loneliness without letting them erase me. Every room held memory. Every window marked a season I had made it through. That's why the announcement cut so deeply. It wasn't about moving, it was about being told that the one thing I had earned outright could be handed away as if it were excess. Looking back, I can see now that this way of thinking didn't begin at the wedding. There were small moments, quiet questions, subtle assumptions that I brushed aside, signs I told myself not to notice. And that was my mistake. Looking back now, the signs were there long before the wedding, scattered quietly through moments I chose not to examine too closely. At the time, I told myself I was being fair, open, generous. I didn't want to be suspicious of people who were about to become family. Lauren's parents carried themselves with an ease that came from always expecting doors to open. Their questions were polite, but specific. They asked about acreage, about how much space surrounded the house, about how quiet it must be living out there alone. Each question felt casual, almost conversational. Yet I remember the way their eyes lingered, measuring more than listening. Daniel seemed drawn to them, to their confidence, their stories, the way they spoke as if the future was already arranged. I watched him absorb that energy, mistaking certainty for stability. When small comments surfaced about how big the house was for one person, or how it might be better not to live alone at my age, I brushed them aside. I told myself it was concern, not assumption. There were moments when something tightened in my chest, a quiet instinct urging me to pause, but I didn't want to appear difficult or ungrateful. I had spent so many years smoothing things over, keeping peace where I could, that it felt natural to minimize my own discomfort. I convinced myself that kindness required flexibility, that love meant not drawing lines too sharply. What I understand now is that politeness can sometimes hide entitlement. Questions can quietly become expectations if left unanswered. By choosing not to address those early signals, I unintentionally allowed others to believe my boundaries were negotiable. I thought I was preserving harmony. In reality, I was ignoring the distant rumble of something that would soon arrive at my door, impossible to avoid and demanding to be faced. I left the wedding before the evening reached its soft conclusions. I didn't wait for cake or farewells. I walked out into the night with my keys heavy in my hand, my chest tight, my thoughts strangely quiet. The drive home felt longer than usual. The road stretched ahead of me in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of tires against pavement and the dull glow of passing streetlights. When I turned onto the gravel path leading to my farmhouse, something immediately felt wrong. The gate stood open, wide in a way I never left it. Lights glowed from windows that should have been dark. My home, usually still and private at that hour, looked awake in a way that didn't belong to me. I parked slowly, my pulse rising with each step toward the door. Before I even crossed the threshold, I heard unfamiliar sounds, movement, laughter that didn't match the quiet the house usually held for me. The door wasn't locked. That alone made my stomach drop. Inside, the air smelled different. A sharp perfume layered over the familiar scent of wood and old paint. Shoes lined the entryway that weren't mine. Bags rested against the wall as if they had always belonged there. I moved through the rooms carefully, touching nothing, feeling like a visitor in a place that had once known every inch of me. They were settled, comfortable, using my kitchen, my furniture, my space. The reality of it hit all at once, heavy and disorienting. For a brief moment, fear and disbelief tangled together, leaving me unsure whether to speak or retreat. Then something steadied inside me. The panic eased, replaced by clarity so sharp it surprised me. This was my house. My name was on every document that mattered. Whatever they believed, whatever had been said earlier that night, this situation had crossed into something real and undeniable. I didn't argue. I didn't confront anyone. I stepped back outside into the cool air, closed the door behind me, and took a long breath. Standing there in the dark, I made a choice. I would not let chaos dictate my next move. I would choose clarity. and I would choose it calmly. I stood outside for a long moment, letting the night air cool the rush in my chest. I focused on simple things: the feel of gravel under my shoes, the sound of insects in the trees, the steady rise and fall of my breathing. I knew that if I stepped back inside too quickly, I would react instead of think. And I had already given this situation enough of my emotions for one night. Clarity came when I reminded myself of facts. This house existed because I built a life that could support it. My name was the one on every paper that mattered. No announcement, no assumption, no family connection could change that truth. Holding on to that thought grounded me in a way nothing else could. I reached out to someone I trusted, someone who had known me long enough to speak plainly without judgment. As I explained what had happened, the chaos of the evening began to sort itself into something understandable. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. I was being pushed aside in my own home, and that was not acceptable. The reassurance I received didn't come wrapped in drama or anger. It came calmly, firmly, and with certainty. I was reminded that ownership isn't a feeling, it's a reality backed by law and reason. Hearing that lifted something heavy from my shoulders. For the first time since the wedding, I felt steady. In that steadiness, I made a decision. I would not argue from pain or panic. I would act from clarity. Boundaries would be set clearly and respectfully, not as a reaction, but as a statement of fact. And I understood something else just as clearly. When boundaries are drawn, they are often tested. I gave them a clear deadline, delivered without anger or apology. I explained what needed to happen and when. I believed that clarity, spoken calmly, would be enough. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that being firm would be respected. It wasn't. The hours passed, then days, and nothing changed. They continued to move through my home as if my words had never been spoken. Belongings stayed where they were. Routine settled in. Every ignored request felt like a quiet dismissal, not loud or confrontational, but heavy all the same. It was as if my boundary had been acknowledged only so it could be set aside. What hurt most wasn't their refusal. It was how easily my concern was minimized. My need for space was treated like inconvenience. My insistence on control over my own home was framed as unnecessary tension. When pressure came, it arrived disguised as reason, urging me to be flexible, to be understanding, to stop making things difficult. That pressure reached me through my son. The weight of it landed hard. I felt the familiar pull to soften, to compromise, to make myself smaller so others could remain comfortable. Being labeled selfish for protecting what I had built cut deeper than I expected. It stirred old habits of self-doubt I thought I had outgrown. But something had changed. I felt the heartbreak without letting it collapse me. I recognized the pattern and chose not to follow it. I understood then that respect would not come from more explanation or patience. If my words were going to be ignored, I would have to let my actions speak instead, and I knew exactly what that meant. When the deadline passed without change, I followed through quietly. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic moment where I had to defend myself again. I chose a path that relied on facts rather than emotion, and that choice made all the difference. The people who arrived to help did so calmly and professionally. They listened, reviewed what they needed to see, and moved with a steady confidence that didn't require explanation. I stayed back, watching from a distance, my hands folded, my breathing finally even. For the first time since that night, I felt supported by something solid and impartial. The shift inside the house was almost immediate. The confidence that had filled the rooms began to drain away. Assumptions collapsed under reality. There was no argument to be had, no story left to tell. What had been treated like entitlement was now clearly recognized as intrusion. The process unfolded without cruelty, but without compromise. As the house emptied, I felt a release I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Tension I didn't realize I was carrying loosened its grip. The rooms grew quieter with every step taken away from them, until silence returned in its familiar, comforting form. Afterward, I changed the locks myself. Each turn of the key felt deliberate, grounding. I reset the alarm, walked through every room, and opened windows to let fresh air move through the space. The house didn't feel victorious. It felt restored, standing there alone. I understood that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in calm sentences, steady actions, and the simple truth of ownership being respected. That night, my home became mine again, not just on paper, but in feeling. With that peace reclaimed, something else quietly began, healing, and the slow work of rebuilding a life that belonged fully to me. In the days that followed, the house settled into a quiet that felt earned. Mornings returned gently. I woke with the sun instead of dread, brewed coffee slowly, and sat on the porch listening to the land breathe again. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt safe. I started small, fixing what had been neglected, tightening a loose rail on the porch, repainting a kitchen cabinet I had always meant to refresh. Each task grounded me. Every finished corner reminded me that this space responded to my care, not to demands placed on it by others. The house and I seemed to be relearning each other. I built a small garden behind the barn, something I had postponed for years. Working the soil with my hands felt honest. Growth followed its own timing, patient and unforced. In the evenings, I walked the property slowly, noticing details I had rushed past before. I wasn't rebuilding to prove anything. I was rebuilding because I finally could. During that time, my neighbor Margaret became a quiet presence. She stopped by occasionally with fresh bread or a few extra seedlings, never asking questions I didn't offer answers to. Her kindness wasn't intrusive. It was steady, respectful, and deeply comforting. It reminded me that support doesn't have to come with expectations attached. As the weeks passed, I felt something shift inside me. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in moments, in calm breaths, in choosing myself without guilt. I knew the past hadn't fully loosened its grip yet. Some stories don't end cleanly. And though peace had returned, I sensed that one final conversation was still waiting to find me. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind I had come to cherish. I was at the local farmer's market, moving slowly between stalls, when I sensed someone nearby hesitate. When I looked up, I saw Daniel standing a few steps away. He looked thinner, older somehow. The confidence I had seen at the wedding was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. I noticed it in the way he held himself, shoulders drawn in, eyes careful. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. He didn't rush. He didn't defend himself. What came through wasn't explanation, but regret. I could feel how much he had replayed everything, how heavy the realization had become for him inside me. Two truths existed at once. The love I had for my son was still there, unchanged and instinctive, but so was the memory of standing alone in that ballroom and the silence that had followed. I let both truths stay. I didn't push either one away. As he shared what had unraveled since then, I understood how deeply he had underestimated the consequences of letting others decide for him. There was remorse in his posture, in the way his hands trembled slightly, in the careful attention he gave to my reactions. I could see that something had broken open in him too. I allowed myself to acknowledge his apology without rushing to comfort it. Forgiveness felt possible in that moment, but trust was something else entirely. Trust would need time, consistency, and respect rebuilt from the ground up. When we parted, there was no resolution, only a quiet understanding. Healing wasn't finished. It was still unfolding, slowly and honestly, and as I walked away, I felt ready to sit with what this journey had taught me, before deciding what came next. When I look back now, the story no longer feels like a single betrayal or a single victory. It feels like a long lesson I needed time to understand. I spent most of my life believing that worth was proven through sacrifice, that if I gave enough, endured enough, stayed quiet enough, I would earn peace. What I learned instead is that peace isn't earned by giving yourself away. It's protected by knowing where you end and others begin. Standing in my home now, In the quiet, I fought to keep. I understand that boundaries are not punishments. They are acts of respect, first toward yourself, and then toward everyone else. The farmhouse was never just a building. It became a symbol of something deeper, my right to choose, my right to say no, my right to take up space without apology. I don't feel anger when I think about what happened. I feel clarity. I can hold love and firmness at the same time. I can forgive without forgetting. I can leave doors open without removing the locks. That balance is something I didn't know how to claim before, but I do now. Life feels quieter these days, but not smaller. In the mornings, when the light moves slowly across the porch and the air feels still, I'm reminded that dignity doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in when you finally stop arguing with your own instincts. If my story reached you, I hope it reminds you of your own right to protect what you've built, whether that's a home, a relationship, or simply your peace. Thank you for sitting with me through this journey. If you've ever had to choose yourself when it was difficult, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. You're not alone.